I want to talk a little bit about a tool that I've been building, which is called Warpa. And for anyone who used to use the old TScript version of TouchDesigner, there used to be a very similar tool called Vertpusher back in the day by Dev Harlan. And this is kind of like a slightly different version of that, but it's essentially the same. The same concept is that you make a mesh and you can warp that mesh. So it's quite a simple 2D mapping tool. So you can see here I've got a cube setup, and this cube setup is a projection mapped set that I'm building. So let's say this was actually a physically made set, then we can obviously projection map this using this tool. So I'm gonna show that by, first of all, when you open up, you have the tool itself, and we can open panel here to open up the control panel. So by default, you want to be in create mode. And create mode, if I scroll with my middle mouse, I can zoom in and out. And then I can right click and drag around. And as I drag around, it's going to move around the canvas. So we can also control the zoom with this slider here. We can control the brightness of the canvas down here. And we can do some snapping, which I'll show in a moment. So the first thing is, if we clear the canvas, that just makes sure that our canvas is ready for drawing things on using draw mode. So if I go to the parameters here, I have draw mode on, off. You can see when I'm draw mode's on, I've got this clear canvas that I can then use to create things. So if I click a point, and then another point, and another point, and another point, then you can see that we can actually start to create a mesh using this tool. So the mesh tool, the creation of the mesh, every quad is a quad. We can make triangles if we want by basically double clicking. So if I make a point here and then click again, then that's going to give me a triangle. So that's how you create quads in the setup. If I move to the select page, I can select a quad, and if I don't like it, I can hit the delete key to delete that out. So that's gone. And I could go back to create, and I can carry on doing what I was doing before. So I can carry on drawing out this mesh. So rather than showing the entire drawing of this mesh, I'm just going to kind of draw some bits, a part of it. And then I can show you how the output is. So there's from the first output of the tool. If I click here, you can see there we've got this mesh, but you can see we've got all this horrible gap where the points aren't aligning. So that's where the snap tool comes in, the snap slider. So the snap slider basically just consolidates any close-up points using a facet sort. And if I right-click view again, you'll see that we get a nice clean edge across those cubes. Obviously, we don't get a clean edge here because we didn't bother finishing drawing all of the mesh. And it'll take about 2 minutes or so to do that, but better to just carry on. So with that done, now I can go into transform. And if I open up my output, just small here. So with my transform, I can start to actually move my mesh across the canvas in X and Y. And this little thing here, we can type values in, or we can use the arrow keys. And if we click on the parameter name, we can actually choose how much we're moving by. So we can actually get finer control by doing that. So we can, type in values, or we can use this ladder. So it's like a parameter ladder, but in like a UI form. And we can rotate, and again, rotate has the same option. If you want to get out of this, you can just click the parameter name again to get out. And you can kind of just do what you want. You can scale uniformly, or you can scale in X, which is very extreme right now, or you can scale in Y as well. So that allows you to basically get your mesh as close to your real life mesh as possible on the projection, and you can kind of just line it up to be roughly correct. And then once you've done that, once you've got things kind of roughly correct on this output, you can then use the warping tool. So we can go into warp now. In fact, before we go into warp, just to point out, create and select are now grayed out because I've transformed. If I reset my transform, I can now go back and create and select things again, but until I reset my transform, I'm not allowed back to those screens. And that's the same for when we do warping. So if we go into warp and I start to click to warp, I can click a point and I can drag it, and it will just drag. And you can see the transform's now grayed out because basically the way that the system works. The transform happens, and then the warp then replaces the point positions. Because we have the zoom and the pan, rather than doing an offset, it actually replaces the point positions. So we can't go back unless we reset our warp, and then that will allow us to go back to transform, and then we can reset and go back to the beginning. Or we can click on the reset panel on Warpa, we can hit reset all, which will just clear everything, including the created mesh. So yeah, so if I'm in warp, I can go in, I can warp things around. I can use my arrow keys to do finer controlled warping, as you can see here. And you can see on the output there, things are, you know, starting to move around a bit there. So you want to kind of just, you know, use your output as your reference and kind of get that right. You can also turn on wireframe and points, but obviously, like this wireframe here, this is not matching the edge of the render. So when you're in draw mode, I wouldn't recommend using these. I would just use your own wireframe from your render. If you have a wireframe setup, then you can use that instead. So yeah, so that's how the tool works generally. You have, you know, create your polys, select the ones you don't want, delete them and recreate, go back into transform and move your mesh roughly into place, and then you can start warping points to match the points on the projection. So that's using the draw mode. There is another mode actually as well. So the original vert pusher tool, if I just clear the canvas too, the original vert pusher tool doesn't use this drawing system. It actually requires you to place in a mesh. So I've actually got that set up here. So when I go to the parameters, if I just close these down, hold this down a bit there. So when I go into the parameters, if I just clear these out as well, when we are in draw mode, we only need the top, and the top is whatever, you know, our render is. In our case, it's this cube setup. But if we are not using draw mode, we need a SOP and a camera comp too. And that allows us to put our own mesh in and not do the drawing. We can skip the draw section basically by just putting in a SOP. So the way that works is it takes the SOP and the camera and it reprojects the texture back onto the mesh using a texture SOP. And to show that, if I have a camera, so this is my camera that I'm rendering with, this is my perspective camera. So this is what the audience will be looking at. It could be your projector camera too, but if you want to have 3D effects, you want it to be the perspective. So we can drag that perspective camera onto the camera comp parameter. And that is now using the camera here. Now, if we want to set up some geometry, now the original set looks like this. So this is the original set. And you can see it's a bunch of cubes. Now the problem with this is that we have these back points on this cube setup. This is not very good for trying to warp with because it's got back points, it's got lots of other stuff. So what I did is in Maya, I just created a consolidated mesh that only shows the front faces, and all of the points are consolidated to a single point for each edge of the cube. And that's really important when you're creating mapping meshes, is to make sure that you have this so that then you can easily map it. The second thing is that when you're doing transforms like I am here, you can't do the transforms at the geo level, because if you do that, it won't match. It has to be at the SOP level. So my transform here is at the SOP level, and that's the same as CamSnapper. CamSnapper also is like that. So then if I drag the SOP, I can drag that onto here, and you'll see that automatically that's now put this canvas into the transform window. So now I can go and transform, and it can move, and I can go warp, and I can start warping my mesh. And I didn't have to draw anything, I just using the pure mesh. And because I'm using the pure mesh, if I have my output over here, if I turn on wireframe and turn on points on my out, it should, oh sorry, that's not my out, that's the demo. Here we go, on my out. So if I have my wireframe and points turned on, now they're actually in exactly the right place. So you can actually now use these as references for mapping. So you can really get that mapping quite tight with the wireframe on there. And again, up, down, left arrows will help you get really fine control over that system. So yeah, so that's pretty much how the tool works in terms of the actual use case. There is one last thing, which is if I turn off wireframe mode, and let's say let's just warp a point just to kind of show this. If I turn off active mode, it's going to give us much more performance. So at the moment, it's using about a millisecond of cook time and about half a millisecond on the CPU. So that's quite a lot of cook time, and ideally we don't want to be using that much when we're just mapping. Like, we want to be able to use that cook time for doing visuals and so on. So one of the things that we can do here is we can turn off active mode, and then what that will do is it will say turn on active toggle to edit, so it'll turn off this panel, but you'll see that our output is still going and we still have our warp in the output. And when we middle click on here, we've just cut down to 0.3 milliseconds and 0.0 something on the CPU time, so it's like 5 times faster on the CPU and about 3 times faster on the GPU there. So that's giving us a lot more performance. And if this was a static image, it should actually just be 0 cook time. If we're not referencing this, we're not looking at it, we've got 0.005 milliseconds. I mean, there's no cook time when you're not using the mapping. So this is very efficient for doing mappings with. So yeah, so that's if actives. And if we want to start editing again, we can just turn active on, do our editing, we can go in, start moving stuff, and then we can turn it off when we're done. One thing to be aware of is that if wireframe and points are on and you turn active off, oh no, I made them automatically turn off. But they do show in the render, so yeah, you need to make sure these are off before you turn off active mode. So that's the control panel. So how do we set up inside? I'll show the inside of the project. So there's a control panel here, which is called container panel, and there's the core, and the core has all the parameters and all of the things that you can do with the tool without the control panel. And then down here we have just some simple parameter execute that just does a couple of things. So we'll start with the core. So the core has 2 outputs. It has the output, which is your projection output, and the output for the viewer. So obviously if we want to use this projection output, we just lay down a window, we can comp it to that, turn the borders off, set it to fill location, and then we can open that up and we can have our outputs. There's our output. So that's fine if we want to do that. The viewer is just if we want to see the viewer in another panel, we can look at it, but we generally don't really need to look at it. So yeah, so we have the core. If we go inside, everything's laid out in a kind of neat way. The logic all lives here. This is the main bit of logic is in the main extension, and this holds all the functionality in terms of the programming is all in this one dat. At least all the programming that doesn't use chops or sops or dat, table dats. And then we have the keyboard shortcuts here. They have a callbacks dat with some simple keyboard shortcuts. We have the parameter execute, which just handles the parameters. We have an execute dat that just checks some things on startup, and we have a check if transformed comp that just checks if we have any transforms, and if we do, then it just disables those panels that we're not allowed to use. So that's the basic functionality all in there. The second most important part is probably this creating points, polys, and warping offsets. So this is where the points get created as dats. These temp dats basically holds the yellow points that we create, and then they get turned into a poly and put into the table as a final poly. That then gets converted into a dat, which then gets sent into GeoElements. So GeoElements is where we do all of the handling. GeoElements has 2 inputs. It has the input from the non-drawn version, which is our main mesh, which is coming from the SOP parameter at the top level. And then we also have an add, which does the draw tool sort of side of things, the drawing mode. And that also does the texturing there for the drawing mode that applies the texture to the correct scale. These can then be switched between, so these are our 2 inputs that we can switch between depending on whether we're using draw mode or not. if we're using draw mode, we then have a facet that does some stuff. I'm not sure why that doesn't live here, but anyway, there's a facet here that does the switch, and another switch. There's a transform here which does the transformation, and this switch is just set to 1, but it was for bypassing the transform for debug. You can hit it to 0. And then there's the points coming from the switch to a DAT. We add our offsets in using this DAT. And obviously they're not offsets, they're actual replacements for the point positions, so they have to go into here. And then finally, that then gets merged back into the DAT2 to create the warp. So that creates our warped mesh. So this is very much the core of the warping is here. We then have a post transform, which is just a null, and this then sends off to a bunch of comps for rendering. So this is like rendering, the selected shape and the wireframe and the points and all those bits. It renders all of those. There's a primitive sub that creates a poly attribute, which is used when selecting the polys. So that gives us the poly that we select through the render pick. And then these go out, and then our final render is this georender. We have two cameras. We have a camera for the viewer and a camera for the output. Obviously the viewer one changes around and moves, the output one is static. We then have the canvas, which is just the background image and the canvas edge. And then we have the pick canvas, which is basically just a massive rectangle, so we can use this for our render picking, so we can get positions of the mouse in the render. We then have some temporary points, which is where our little yellow, this is where all our yellow rendered polys go in create mode, in the create page, sorry. And then we have a sort of, this is like a picker for selecting what we're rendering, and it switches out based on some parameters basically for the output. So that's the general render pipeline, and obviously the input texture comes in and that goes on to a constant, and the constant can switch between itself and this remap GLSL shader. So when we turn active mode off, we just get a remap out that we can then use for whatever we want, and I'll show that in a moment. So up here, the render pick handling, we're handling render picking in this callback, and we can, that's just sending information off to the main extension to do some stuff. And we also have a little bit of handling here for the scroll and the pan, zoom and pan. And then we have the warp point, comes from the chop directly because it does some other bits there as well. So that comes directly from the render pick chop, and then does the panel chop, and then the render pick dat does the actual render picking. We then have the render for the viewer and the output, and they then go through to the out, and the output render has some other little gubbins here, which is the remap. So the map, when it's rendered, gets, if active mode is off, it locks the null map, which is not the cleanest way of doing things, but it's fine, I think, in terms of not storing stuff on people's disk. So that will lock the null map. That will then get piped into this remap, and the remap just takes the inputs, and the null map remaps it, sends it to a switch for between active and non-active, and then it multiplies it with a threshold to get rid of some weird background issues that might occur in the remapping process. And then that gets anti-alias if we have aliasing on, and then it goes out. And then that sends out. Then in the control panel, we just have UI kit, which is my UI kit. So I'm using that rather than widgets, because when you have a lot of widgets, it can get quite heavy for pages. So that's, I'm using this, it's quite lightweight. It doesn't cook when you're not using it. And I'll leave it as widgets, but it's kind of quicker when it is cooking. So, and there's a main extension in here, which is doing some bits for the panels, like opening up the Are You Sure panel. And then there's just some control panels. There's basic control panels with pages and parameters, and there's bits inside here, and you can go inside. It's very much, it gets quite nested because that's how I work with control panels. But yeah, it's just a panel to control everything that's going on in here. And the panel, you can actually choose which mapper comp you're controlling, so you could have multiple cores, and then you can swap them out here, and that should work in theory. Yeah, so that's it. So that's the final, the final output. The last thing is the aliasing. Aliasing is there for if you're using draw mode and you cut across a shape. If you don't have aliasing on, you'll probably get a jaggy edge. But my advice would be to not make a poly edge inside of the mesh, but to make sure you always have the poly edge on the black outside of the island. So make sure that you kind of create an island for each shape that you're making. Just have it a little bit outside, and then that will fix that. And then if you want to reset everything, you can go to reset and you can hit reset all, and that's going to reset all of the internal parameters on here. Obviously, because we're not in draw mode right now, you don't see that, but if I go to active on, go to the create tab, you can see we no longer have any drawing here. So if I go reset all, it should reset all of them. Yeah. So that's it. So if there's any questions, they can go on the GitHub, and hopefully everyone, enjoys using it. Thanks.